In this next Vicious Engine tutorial, we're going to be setting up a dynamic object. Now, a dynamic object is any object in the scene that needs to change or interact with the player or animate. And in this case, what we've got is a torch. And so what we're going to do is set up this torch so that it can be exported as a dynamic object. And then we'll place the torch in the environment, and we'll set it up in the editor so that the torch can interact with the player. So the player can walk up to the torch and light it, and so then the torch will spawn our flame particle effects. So the first thing that we need to do is create a dynamic. We'll come over here to our exporter window and open the exporter, and we need to create a dynamic mesh root. So I'm going to pick Add Dynamic Mesh Root here, and you'll notice that we have one now right in the center of our viewport. And what I'm going to do is just give this a name, and I'm going to call it obj_torch. OBJ standing for object, of course. And we're going to scale down our bounding radius so it just encompasses our object there. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that I've got the pivot point set right here at the back. And so, unlike our character where we put the pivot point of the dynamic mesh root right in the middle of the model, what I'm doing here is I'm putting the pivot point right at the back, and that's where the torch will connect with the wall. Now, this pivot point is what you move around when you move the object in the editor, and that's why I'm putting it right here on the back, so that you can line the pivot point up right nicely with the wall. Whereas, if you put the pivot point in the middle, you'd have to do more guesswork. But since I'm putting it back here, I can easily align my torch with the wall. Okay, so now I need to take my torch object and link it to my dynamic mesh root. Remember, anything that's linked to the mesh root or linked to something that's linked to the mesh root and on down the hierarchy, anything that's in the hierarchy below the mesh root basically is what's going to get exported. Now, the next thing I want to do is define the point where my flame particle effects are going to be spawned. And that particle effect needs to come out of the part on the torch where the fire is going to be, obviously. So I need to mark that spot somehow. And the way that we do that in the Vicious Engine is with a point helper. So what I can do is come in here to my torch, and under my nodes, you'll see that I have a list of the nodes. Now, this is named Box01 here, so we should probably fix that. I'm just going to name it, instead of Box01, I'm going to name it Torch Mesh to be a little more clear. So you'll notice that that updates here. And what I want to do is right-click on Torch Mesh and pick Create Helper. And a helper point, so it's called MH_, and I'm going to name it Flame. So this is going to give me a point, and the little helper point looks like that. It's just a little axis tripod with a yellow dot in the middle. And that's going to give me a place in the editor where I can say spawn the flame here on this helper. So it's not really triangles or anything, it's just a specific point in space where I can attach something or tell something to happen. So I'm going to put this helper point right here where I want my flame particles to spawn, right in the middle of the fiery part of the torch. And then I'm going to make sure that my mesh helper is parented to my torch object. So that will export as an extra node on my character, and I'll be able to spawn my fire particles. You can use mesh helpers for all kinds of things. If you want to attach an object and put it in the player's hand, you can put a mesh helper on the player's hand and then attach the object to that. Anywhere where you need a point to spawn something from or attach something to, you can use a mesh helper for that. Now, if you're putting a mesh helper on a character and you already have a bone in the position where you're putting a mesh helper, the mesh helper is redundant because you can always attach or spawn your object from the bone point instead of the mesh helper. But in this case, I don't have any way of specifying that position. So I put a mesh helper there so that I can know when I spawn my fire particles, we're going to spawn them right from that position. Now the last thing that I need to do is set up my material. So you'll notice that my material is just a standard max material. So what I'm going to do is bring up the editor here really quick in the material panel. So if we go to the map level, I'll just go into materials and then hit create, and we're going to create a one-pass model material. Come down here to the texture. We're going to create a new texture map and drop this down. And the texture that I've painted for my torch is called E2 Torch. And I already put it in the Data PC TGAs folder, so it's showing up in this list. So I'm going to pick E2 Torch, and we only need color. So I'm going to come back here and give my material the same name as my texture, E2 Torch. And that should be it. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And we'll go back to max. And instead of standard material, I'm going to pick... well that's interesting. I've got my renderer set to mental ray right now, and so our VE material isn't showing up in our materials list. So what I need to do is come up here to rendering and pick render, and come down here in the common tab. I need to come down here and pick assign render. Instead of mental ray renderer, I need to have that set to the default scanline renderer. Now when I open up my material type, I have the VE material available. So I'm going to go ahead and pick VE material, and I'll drop down my list of available materials, and we're going to pick E2 Torch to assign the torch material to our object. So now we're all ready to export our dynamic torch object, and so I'm going to come in here to the exporter and just pick our torch object, and we're going to hit export the torch. So my statistics window comes up and it tells me that my export is finished, and so we're ready to come back into the editor. So I'll bring up the editor, come back here to the map level, and we're going to set up a new entity template. So I'll hit create under the entity templates list, and we're going to call this the OBJ torch. And for my model template, I'll drop down my list and pick torch. This is the object that I just exported. And now I can hit show preview, and you'll notice that my previewer comes up, and I've now got my torch object exported, and it's all ready to be set up with the game logic so that it can interact with the player. Now you'll notice that the helper that I added isn't showing up, but if I come down here to helpers in my list and I pick MH Flame from my list, now you can see the little access tripod where my helper is that I exported. So the helper doesn't show up as a mesh object, but if I pick to display a helper, it'll show up. So in the next tutorial, we're going to go over the process of setting up the game logic on my entity template so that when the player approaches the torch and pushes a certain button, the torch will light and spawn our particle effect.